guys. As you might hear from my voice, I'm coming down with the flu, so I'm trying to hang in there for this couple of hours, after which I'll probably collapse, but I'm okay. Yeah, I'm gonna talk to you about free-to-play, obviously, and some people might have noticed that I've changed my title compared to the program online. But essentially, it's the same talk. This is really a combination of two talks I've been giving in conferences around the world during the last 6 months or so. And I'm essentially going to talk about the sustainability of the free-to-play model and how to get there, and then introduce like two different sort of high-level approaches to how to design free-to-play into your product, or approach the product design in that sense. And I'll probably talk a lot about many of the same things that Toit Weidemann talked to you guys like last week, if you were there. But I mean, mine is still a slightly different angle, I believe, and as always, I believe if there's any repetition, it's gonna work for the best. So just quickly about myself, why am I here? Thanks Ilkka for inviting me, by the way. So I started my real commercial game development like more than 10 years ago. I did some game design for Fat Hammer, who were basically building a 3D engine for mobile phones more than 10 years ago, which seems quite a big feat if you think about where the mobile phones are today. But then it seemed Nokia was backing that and all that, and then the guys kind of came up with this idea that okay, the best way to sell that 3D engine is via games. So I was involved in designing some of their early games. Then I spent some time actually working on online gambling. I worked for the National Lottery Company here in Finland, basically developing lots of different stuff for their online product offering. Simple games, as you see here, basically scratch cards in the internet, but with a few twists. And at that time, I also have this like semi-academic side to my career. So I started working on my PhD back like late 1990s when I graduated. My background is in the humanities. So I guess I'm like the archetype of when people ask that, okay, where do game designers come from? So they come from any possible place. So I studied comparative literature, but then I started a PhD on games, and as was working on it besides other jobs for a number of years, managed to finally complete it 2008. Called Games Without Frontiers. It's about how to analyze games with different approaches and the structure of games and the psychology of games from the player perspective. So, and it tried to create these kinds of design recipes for games as well, but as often happens with academic theory, even design theory, it's kind of like I honestly can't say sort of pinpoint the page you should read on that PhD to get something out of it. It's more like an inspirational work at this point, I feel. But still, it was a big accomplishment for me personally. So then that gave me actually kind of like a calling card to see that if the academic career would be for me. So I left. I spent like a year and a half in Copenhagen. Researching games and teaching games at the local university. And because I had this background in online gambling and lottery games, which are of course very simple, I grew interested in Facebook games, which were like picking up at that time, and I did some consulting design on a number of projects, and then also dipped my toes in different online games, ranging from fantasy sports leagues to children's MMOs. Before then joining Digital Chocolate, so I returned to Helsinki I realized that the academic life is not for me. I wanted to make games rather than write about them, even if I kind of enjoy both. But anyhow, so I worked with Digital Chocolate. We were especially focusing on Facebook games because that was a big thing during that time. So, for instance, a game like Army Attack was fairly successful. But then last August, I joined Grand Crew, and basically working there as a product lead, which means that I'm leading a small team in prototyping a new game, a free-to-play concept. So it's going to be the second game that Grand Crew is getting out there. So how many of you have played Supernauts? Okay, most of you. So if you haven't, go download it. It's available in Finland. It's available in Canada at the moment. So just an example of how games are distributed and published and launched nowadays. So we use different markets to test the game. And actually, if you want to have a topical kind of like analysis assignment of how games are being iterated during a kind of like a limited launch, you should download Supernauts now from the Finnish App Store and kind of like make some notes how the game operates, what are the different aspects. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to make a major update to the game, which doesn't change, the fundamentals of the game, but change some interesting things. So comparing those findings, you could get a pretty good view on how companies like us operate in trying to tweak the game, optimize them based on the data that we get from the limited market, and tracking, analyzing metrics, and all that. All right. So basically, we all have probably witnessed that there has been this rise of the free-to-play market. And that's essentially my sort of how I frame this talk. So this is from TechRadar, like 2009. And basically a piece contemplating on whether free really is the future of gaming. And it's kind of like funny that now, only like less than 5 years later, when you load this old page, it gets like surrounded by free-to-play game ads. So something has changed, supposedly. But I mean, even if now I'm focusing most on free-to-play, mostly on mobile, because that's the relevant thing nowadays, we have to remember that free-to-play is really a business model among others. So even if these kinds of writings having to do with digital distribution and sort of the age-old sort of retail model of putting your game out there on the shelf and asking 60 euros or 70 bucks, whatever, for it. This was touted, for instance, in this kind of famous piece like 3 years ago. But at the same time, just like 6 months ago, we saw Grand Theft Auto 5 sort of ramp up huge numbers just basically on an opening day of those expensive one-time purchases, which are supposedly facing extinction according to this piece. So free-to-play is definitely a trend. It is very lucrative at the moment, and that's why, of course, it's sort of people and developers gravitate towards it. But I mean, it's not the only way, and we're going to see some other examples during this talk about how you can also screw that up. So I'm going to talk about how has free-to-play evolved, and that leads to my kind of like a sort of a war cry to fellow developers that I've been using this talk, is to how we need to operate, how do we need to design these games to keep this model sustainable, so that it doesn't just become a fad in the bigger scheme of things, and we don't drive players away with you could say overtly aggressive monetization techniques, bad design, and stuff like that. So this is the agenda for the day. So I'm gonna run through this like a crash course to free-to-play history, and then I'm gonna introduce two models, as I mentioned early on, of how to approach free-to-play product design really in terms of games. Then I'm gonna cover some of the sort of ways that you can fail with free-to-play and how people have actually failed with it. And then I'm gonna talk about the dilemma of how you should be able to build a product which both accommodates free play, totally free play, and then that small percentage of players who actually pay for the game and creates revenue for you. And then that leads me to this idea of that we need to evolve free-to-play to keep it sustainable. And so I'm going to compare like what are the way I say term it devolved forms of free-to-play and how as developers we should avoid them because they basically, at least in my mind, make this model non-sustainable. All right, so let's go to the crash course to free-to-play history. So I have a number of timelines, both having to do with games and then having to do with, for instance, what kind of virtual goods have been on offer in these games throughout the last, let me get my math right, 17 years or so. So this timeline starts from 1997, and I've divided this sort of history of games into 3 different eras. So the first is called the MMO era, and that brings us to the Facebook era, which brings us to the app era that we are now living. This is just my division, but kind of makes sense, I think. So let's look at the first, reportedly first game with in-app purchases, microtransactions, whatever you want to name them. So it's called Aki Järvinen. It was a text-based MMO, very similar to MUDs, which you might be familiar with. So text-based worlds, RPG, has a lot of items, different resources, and these were actually the virtual goods that were sold in the game. So that's reportedly the first one. And even back in the day, it's created some controversy among the players, at least that's what Wikipedia tells us. And then a game that is still running, notable game from other kind of a genre. So Neopets, your classical virtual pet concept online, you collect them all, very Pokemon inspired, but still going. I don't know if it's going strong, but it's going. So they definitely got something right. And it had, and I haven't checked back, but at least used to have this very typical dual currency system that you know you used. RuneScape, early MMO, graphical MMO targeted to the younger audience versus, for instance, World of Warcraft, still out there. And then what often gets mentioned in the free-to-play concept is that, or context, is that the Asian market adopted all this much faster and you know, in a more prominent way than the Western market. And these are 2 key titles: Maple Story in Korea and also Kart Rider in Korea. So an RPG and basically a kart racing game that we're selling virtual goods and we're free to start with PC downloadable titles. And then from this I take you to the Facebook era. So if you look back at what was the sort of, when did Facebook start really as a service and a platform to pick up, and what were the first like games out there, they were of course very simple. I want to mention Zynga Poker because of course Zynga is the key name, a company that gets mentioned with Facebook especially. And it's important to notice that Zynga Poker, which probably still is making money for them in a significant way, launched already in 2007. Of course, I mean, poker is a very familiar concept. It is a fundamentally social game, but still, I mean, you weren't playing for real money, you were playing for fake money, for a virtual currency that you could use. So that was definitely something different. You couldn't cash money out. Of course, there's online poker sites been around since the dawn of the internet, more or less, that you can cash out, and that's gambling. This wasn't gambling in the traditional sense, but still hugely popular and still going strong. Happy Farm launched in China 2008 in one of their social networks. The reason that I mentioned this is kind of obvious, that there was a game, it still is a game called Farmville, and basically it's this game. And like really during 2008, people started to open their eyes in the possibilities of Facebook as a gaming platform, because then you could see news stories circulating, for instance, Mob Wars, a simple sort of resource management type of a game, was making reportedly over $20,000 per day on Facebook. So that sort of raised some eyebrows, and basically news stories like this led to the kind of a gold rush into Facebook, that there's supposedly easy money there and all that, but it wasn't quite that easy as those of you who have followed the scene know. And then Zynga was cranking out these basically clones of existing concepts in a very smart way. I don't want to slag them off because of that. They were smart and they saw what was working. There were some sort of slightly fishy methods of doing stuff, but anyhow. And then 2009 was like the pinnacle, really, that Farmville launched, and really, like, the very big thing was that, of course, it brought people that didn't play games of any kind, really, to play games on Facebook and into this whole free-to-play microtransaction context in terms of business models. And what is also interesting is that we started seeing in 2009 a bit of a diversion in terms of what kinds of games you could play on Facebook. So Kingdoms of Camelot is one of the early ones from Kabam, very competitive, actually pretty hardcore game, but started getting some good success, and actually has been a very, very successful game in terms of business. But at the same time, it was not only Facebook, even if Facebook was the sort of dominating platform there, of course, like, there's this whole other world of gamers and their platforms, PC being the sort of most traditional platform besides the consoles. So what was happening there was also big companies like Electronic Arts launching free-to-play games on the browser or as downloadable clients. So Battlefield Heroes, a third-person shooting game, was launched and supposedly did okay, and actually it was a big part of a bigger initiative with EA. So they launched this Play for Free portal, which had a number of games. Then a milestone title really in this space, League of Legends, a huge game nowadays, also launched in 2009. So if you don't know League of Legends and you're interested in space, do definitely check it out. And also then what we started hearing was that traditional, if you could say traditional at this point, but still MMOs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, which had been based on the subscription model, so on a monthly fee, this World of Warcraft still is. They started to, maybe some in a sort of desperate move, others maybe more in a calculated manner, started moving into free-to-play. And reportedly, Dungeons & Dragons Online was the first prominent title that did this, 2009. And they then told that they tripled their revenue. Of course, we don't know what the original revenue was, so we don't really know how profitable that was, but still triple. So something they did right with that decision. Okay, so yeah.
Could I ask, how did Jenga Poker make money? What was their?
Well, basically, they sorry. Oh yeah, so the question was that how did Zynga Poker make money? So, to be honest, I haven't checked back into the game in years, but at least to start with, so basically what you did in the game was that you got basically amount of virtual currency, and of course that was what you used for the games as a stake. So that, and how poker operates when there's it's sort of a zero-sum game, and there's a rake with the operator. So when we talk about free-to-play economies inside the games, there's always sinks of that virtual currencies, and then there are sources of that. So what they did was that basically some players won the pot. They got a lot of that currency that they could use to get, for instance, up to higher tables. So important part in an online poker anyways, to match people, so that if you're an expert, I don't want to play with you or I don't even necessarily have the money to play with you. So you can put like stake limits and stuff like that. So they have all that, still have all the sort of poker conventions in place, and it's just because it's based on poker on the long run is even if it has random elements, lots of them as a game in the long run it's based on skill really. So that means that it's a fundamentally a multiplayer game which starts to sort of dictate itself. So it's more about then as a game developer who operates that game is for you to see that you're able to match the big rollers against each other so that they don't steal stuff from the others. But basically it was working sort of with that basic virtual currency model where that was basically a stake. And I can't remember what stuff you could do with yours. You had a visual representation, an avatar in the game. Could you buy stuff for it? I honestly don't remember.
So did they sell the virtual currency? Or
Yes. So let's say that I get really into the game. I lose all my virtual currency, so then they offered me like, hey, use $5 to get 10,000 virtual currency, which then I could see that, okay, I can play like 2 weeks with this money, and that was it. So that also highlights the basic idea that retention is everything. Retaining your players is everything in this model, because if you don't retain enough players from the first couple of tries, you're not able to ever grow the game, because basically the ship is sinking in a way that and that's crucial. I'll come back to that later. Okay, any other questions at this point? All right, I'll move on to the app era, as I call it. So, still one mention about Zynga. So it's important that even if in 2010 we start to see like the transition, it's easy to say now, like looking back, that the transition really started then. But from Facebook to mobile, it still was Zynga's reportedly last, I don't want to say only, but last profitable year. And that was of course on the back of Farmville, those Mafia games, and then Cityville, which launched that year and was really like I would say had the best production values and was very solid game as a city builder, and also a step into a new but still very casual mainstream genre for Zynga. And then important title, if you think about today, is Backyard Monsters from Casual Collective, company nowadays called Kixeye. And it's basically was based on a PC title called Desktop Defenders, which is probably a version of a StarCraft mod. That's details. What is important here is that Clash of Clans is essentially Backyard Monsters. So the most successful game, at least in the Western market, was basically based around this formula that Backyard Monsters originated in 2010 on Facebook and was very, very successful. And also, like, even if Rovia and Angry Birds haven't been dipping their toes in the free-to-play before Angry Birds Go, which is a recent title, they, like a year after the original Angry Birds was launched, they did produce an update where they added a very significant virtual good into the game, and that was the Mighty Eagle that helped people to solve those levels that they were stuck with, and I believe they made good results. So it wasn't really like a free-to-play move, but it was an important microtransaction, a virtual good that they added based on seeing what happens in the market. And then 2011 was kind of like a stagnating period for Facebook games, for instance. Nothing much, I think, happened, and so the momentum was building towards mobile games, really. So 2012 was a very important year. So a number of these hugely popular titles, still popular ones, Candy Crush Saga, Clash of Clans, Heyday, also like a month before Clash of Clans, and Puzzle and Dragons also in Japan launched like mid 2012. And of course on the app era side, like if I would pick one important title from last year, there is this interesting fact that if you look at the most top grossing games of last year, 2013, most of them are from 2012. So there seems to be this trend going on now that during last year, game developers were basically trying to repeat the success of these titles, but not doing that well. These titles kept dominating the markets. And then efforts like a very good game, Plants vs. Zombies, turning them in a sequel into the free-to-play model didn't really work. There's lots of good analysis why Plants vs. Zombies, even if they got huge amounts of downloads because of the title, it's a very well-known game, the first one, they were really too lax with the in-game economy, and that didn't translate into a lot of revenue. So that's an interesting case as well, and still ongoing. Let's see what they do with it. But obviously, you know, stuff was happening elsewhere. World of Tanks, another milestone title, launched 2011 for PC, super competitive tank online battle game, still making millions of dollars. And also Valve, which is a very prominent PC developer, they have a Team Fortress 2, which is also an online shooter. They also made this move that they took it to the free-to-play model, and reportedly said that the revenues went 12 times as high as before. So interesting case that as well. And on the couple of recent interesting launches on the console side of things, of course now we are in a point where both PS4 and Xbox One, the next generation consoles, have come out, and we are starting to see more and more free-to-play games on those platforms. And now, if you want to sort of see a couple of interesting cases of player reception towards free-to-play model in a product that's, you know, costs like 70 euros to start with, there are a couple of examples. So Forza Motorsport 5, a launch title for Xbox One, and then NBA 2K14, a basketball game. For both of these titles, they have a certain kind of a virtual currency system on top of that 70 euro price tag. So, and especially NBA 2K14 has been met with a lot of complaints. I'll come back to that later, but basically, I can like see it that these guys producing so-called AAA console titles are, in terms of the sophistication of the free-to-play model, they are like 3 years behind what is happening in the mobile space. They are learning and making those same mistakes that developers made with many Facebook games and early mobile titles. But we'll come back to that. And an interesting case is supposed to happen this year. So SingStar, the very sort of successful franchise, is supposedly going free to play, rebooting the franchise during this year. So it's interesting to see how that works out. All right, I'm almost done with the history lesson. A couple of different perspectives to the same timeline still. So if you look at in terms of genres, game genres, what kind of games have embraced free-to-play during these 17 years or so, or 21 years actually, my math fails me. No, 17, what am I saying? Okay. You can see that actually, at least on this sort of a long sample of time, there's been quite a lot of different ones. So we have the MMORPGs, we have virtual pets, we have shooters, racing games. We have these very hardcore, different sort of, you could say, sub-genres of strategy games, real-time strategy games, so-called 4X games. Then we have also, this really coincides with the Facebook move that we are seeing more sort of casual genres coming into the forefront. So city simulators, managements, even hidden object games, which are still can be very popular on Facebook, and match 3, i.e. Candy Crush, and then games like Infinite Runners, where you basically try to run with the character as far as you can. Have been games like Subway Surfer has been really successful on iOS at least. And if we then once again shift the perspective to another one, so if you look at what kind of virtual goods have there been on display, so it started from these sort of selling skills and gear in the early RPGs, then selling those different currencies, which you can basically sink into different things. You have resources, consumable items that you use in the games. You have also decorative stuff like League of Legends, which I've mentioned is basically selling only aesthetic, decorative stuff for your fighters, and still they are making zillions because, well, I don't have one reason why, but they seem to have nailed this formula that because it's a very skill-based, very hardcore game, then people are willing to show off not only their skill, but how their characters look. Is there any League of Legends players here, actually? So you probably know much better what you're talking about. Yeah, because that game is certainly a game which for an early user, it's very intimidating, at least at this point when it's been played in such high, almost professional level. And then you have stuff like, I'm gonna return to World of Tanks a bit. They had this model where they basically, you have ammo in the game, which you use to shoot others with your tank, with your cannons. And they were selling premium ammo, which made more damage, so it was more powerful ammo. And the risk in that kind of solution is that you end up in this pay-to-win scenario, so that those who pay are much more powerful and are going to win the game. And that's something that we want to avoid as free-to-play developers, because that easily then alienates the players who don't pay. And then you might ask, okay, what are those guys worth for us if they don't pay? Well, they basically grow the player base, and they might have definitive worth in terms of virality, inviting the players into the game and all that, because user acquisition, getting players to actually find your game these days is super difficult and super expensive at this moment, at least. And then there's interesting, if you want to sort of understand the details, there used to be a very prominent way, kind of like an energy mechanic in a number of Facebook games, which basically limited the time that a player could spend with the game. So you had like an energy resource, and if you made a move in the game, one energy resource was taken away from you, and if you ran out of energy, you would have to wait for the energy to regenerate or buy more energy. And that worked pretty well, like around these times, like 2010, but then it was really sort of considered as that it's not actually really good game design. It's very artificial way to kind of like stop and halt the player's process. So it kind of like went away before it was kind of like reinvented, I would say, in Candy Crush Saga, which basically takes this sort of age-old arcade game mechanic of selling. When the game you sort of run out of tries, it sells you more tries. And it's a kind of an energy mechanic as well. But so let's see, I'm kind of like talking for the evolution of the free-to-play model. So let's see what we're gonna see in like this year, whether this is gonna be new kinds of monetization sinks and sources and techniques. But I mean, if you look at these two slides here, it's really kind of gives you a picture that pretty diverse stuff has been tried with, and even developers have been successful with. So there's not, it kind of really proves that the free-to-play model can be adapted to different genres. It has a diversity of different ways you can try to monetize your players and stuff like that. And of course that then makes it, you could say, even more difficult to find the right genre and find the right mix of how you want to monetize your players, because the competition is super tough. All right. Any more questions? Yeah.
Have you seen successful free-to-play kind of casual games on other platforms than Facebook and mobile?
Well, I think that you could say that Heyday from Supercell is basically banking on the same very casual farming genre, so I would pick that up definitely.
I mean, on PC or console, or?
Oh, PC and console.
All mid-core, hardcore.
Let me think. Can somebody come up with one? I can't think right now of a sort of a title that would have been originally out on consoles, for instance, free to play that would be casual, because there are games like now Warframe for PS4, which is, once again, it's shooter, blah blah blah. It's not that casual. So on those platforms, I don't think that really has been nailed, unless my memory totally fails me.
On PC, I'd say Habbo Hotel.
Sorry?
On PC, I would say Habbo Hotel.
Yeah, of course. Habbo was also more of a virtual environment. But yeah, good point. Yeah.
Is Pego 2 going to be free to play?
Which one?
Pego 2.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm actually not sure. It's supposed to come out really soon, right? So, but I mean, having had the not so successful Plants vs. Zombies 2, it's interesting to see what they're doing with it, definitely. So it's basically from the same company, PopCap, owned by EA nowadays. Yeah, that's one to follow. Great game, the first one at least. Okay, I'll move into the two different approaches to free-to-play, and they are basically these. So this is mostly looking from game design perspective, but you have to understand that with free-to-play games, game design is not quite what it used to be. I'll touch upon that later as well, but I mean, game design has to take into account factors like retention and monetization in a much more sort of concrete way than in the sort of traditional way of designing games for the retail shelf, for instance, or for premium distribution in general. So I'm going to talk about the core and surface model, and one is not better than the other. They just have different relations, and I mean, you could divide these into number of subcategories, but I just want to try to keep this simple. And if you remember the original title of my talk here, it sort of poses this question that free-to-play tricky to design. And so I'm going to evaluate these models on the level of trickiness. And I would say that designing the core according to the core model is way more trickier than designing according to the surface model. But yeah, that doesn't make the core model necessarily better than the other one. It's kind of like if you're a game developer and you look at your upcoming product and you still can make decisions about it and like shape your audience and your expectations and all that. These are like two ways to go about it, two high-level ways. So let's go first through the surface. So basically, it's these games where you are distributing the game for free, and then you're selling more content. So your game is structured in a way that you are able to sell more content that gives more gameplay. So the most sort of archetypal form of this model is that you have a game like Angry Birds or Where's My Water, which I'm going to use as an example here, which is a series of puzzles based on that you have one level, it presents a puzzle, and then you, in the free version, let's say you have 50 of those levels, and then you ask for a couple of bucks for another 50 or something like that. And it's like, it also I can include this whole Mighty Eagle, Space Eagle thing here, because it's the mechanic that helps you, if you're stuck in a level, to get past it in this kind of a game. Because this essentially has the same similar feature or aspect in a sense that it's selling a particular game mechanic, access to that for the player for convenience, basically, to, if they are frustrated, try to sort of give them something to, get beyond that frustration. So then basically the design of this surface model has to be sort of planned into the content structure of the game. So if you want to try to make money this way, I would say that you need to be able to crank out those new levels or those new mechanics in the form of Mighty Eagles or Space Eagles or whatever in a very good sort of return of investment ratio, because then you can actually make money out of that. And for instance, when we were making Facebook games, the early ones at Digital Chocolate, we were facing this problem that we called the content treadmill, that we made a game that turned out to be pretty successful, but in order to update the game and put more content into it, like for instance creating the levels actually took quite a lot of work, because we didn't build any specific tools for the designers or the artists in the team for that. So the return of investment, even if the game was successful, wasn't really good, because it took a lot of man hours to put that new content in. So the smart move would be to design your game in a way that it's easy to crank out new stuff, because then you keep the kind of like expenses low and can produce new content. So an archetypal example is Where's My Water, game from Disney. That was this puzzle game where you had to guide or let this crocodile character find the water, so to speak. And they were basically, you can't see it here, but if you go to the App Store, you can see they are basically selling more levels mostly. And now, is designing this, implementing this into a game tricky? Not really. You basically, as I said, you have to have that structure in place. And also what is working for this model is that the value proposition for the player is very clear. That, you know, okay, you played our 20 or so levels, why don't you like them? Because you got this far, why don't you buy 20 more? It only costs you like $2. So pay to play more. It's very easy to understand. So if you look at, so if you try to summarize the characteristics or qualities of this model, it's really as strong as that simple mechanic. For instance, the puzzle mechanic in Where's My Water, which was pretty strong, so it was a successful game. But then again, usually that means that if you are able to sell those levels, it sort of reflects back to your game design that it can't be overtly complex, because if you go to that complex direction, as we're going to see in a moment, then you are actually going towards the core model, as I term it, where you then have multiple other ways to monetize players. And as said, it's crucial, it's tied to how you organize the content production, how you manage it. And there's no need to include a virtual currency in your game design, which can be really tricky, especially if you don't have experience of this field. But the sort of downside is that once that one player who really loves your game has played those 100 levels that you've been able to put out, there's really no more to play unless, or at least to monetize. You know, you can try to keep the player in the game to try to get 3 stars with each level or whatever. But if you don't have more content to give, then they might abandon the game. So there's not like infinite sinks of money that they can put into it. It's like basically a simple equation of how many content packs a particular player, a customer has bought. So that's like lifetime value of that player for your company. So that was the surface model. I'll move on to the core. And this is super much more complex. So basically what I mean with the core model is that you have this model where you have to create a whole virtual economy of sinks and sources and different things of how to basically make the player lose those resources and want to get more. So it opens up kind of like a web of different related things of how then you can monetize the player by giving them, selling them convenience, selling them like faster progress through the game and all that. And I'll give you more examples in what follows. And this is definitely tricky to design. This is back from maybe 2010 when I tried to kind of like get an overview of one of our games under development of how the economy works, how you put things in motion and they last 5 minutes and then you come back to collect stuff like in Farmville and these kinds of games, and how all that figures into the game economy and where are the sinks and sources. So and we definitely made big mistakes in our early games. When I joined Digital Chocolate end of 2009, we were pretty far into development on a game called Safari Kingdom, it was this kind of like a zoo farming game. You farmed animals and took care of them, and it was a very nice game. We had good retention when it came out, but we completely failed the economy. There was some huge inflation in the game, so players could be able to get the so-called soft currency, which is used in the game to buy more stuff, way too easily. So we were much more sort of too charitable, so to speak. So it was really hard to drive the players into a point that, okay, now I don't have stuff that I want to buy it with real money. So the game didn't monetize at all. And even if we tried to fix the economy, there were some core decisions that had been made, and it just didn't work. So, but we learned a lot from that game. So the next titles, we put those learnings into the next titles like Zombie Lane and Army Attack, which were much more successful games. So it's definitely a learning process, and when I refer to the AAA console developers strutting their stuff nowadays, it kind of like feels that they are in that place. They don't really understand how you should basically create that economy and so on and so forth. But I mean, besides inflation, with inflation, of course, what happens is that the sources we've cranked them up too high. The players get too much of that virtual currency. But then you can go the mistake of going the other way. You crank them too tight, and the players don't get anything, and it becomes a struggle, which is not really fun. And you might have some fundamental problems in the design of the game, that the players just don't get enough of that virtual currency that you need them to have. So you can screw this up in multiple ways. That's why it's difficult. And then you might, introduce sort of a very nice progression, what we say is like a first-time flow or the first sessions to the game. But then you hit them with a very steep paywall that, okay, if you don't pay, your progress in the game is going to slow down to a sort of snail's level. That's one way to drive lots of players away at that point. Even if you would like to get to open their pockets in an early stage when they start the game. Yes?
How do you model this kind of stuff in the development phase?
I'll show you one example that actually Thursday's speaker has produced, so you'll see. So I'll just sum up this first. Basically, the qualities of this core model. This is very tough in terms of getting it right, so that you don't alienate the free players. They have values, as I mentioned. They might tell their friends. In Facebook, the whole sort of Facebook feed posting, the virality stuff was very prominent at one time at least. But then this means that you basically, as a game developer who designs the economy of the game and the monetization techniques, has to sort of basically come into terms with the fact that sooner or later you have to give everything to the players for free, and then you just basically hope that you have enough players who have stayed with the game that they are able to and willing to pay for something. Conversion into paying users is a lot tougher than with the Surface model, because the value proposition is much more complicated. Of course, in good game designs, you try to make that value proposition very, very clear, but usually, as I'll come to show a bit later, it tends to be so that the Surface model works with lots more sort of casual titles, whereas the core model sort of very often takes your game into a more complicated, more hardcore direction, more sort of game for gamers and that stuff. But so both have like their upsides. But then, if you manage to do that conversion, what is much more so valuable here when compared to the Surface model is that if you run in the Surface model, if you are able to crank out just like a couple of content packs, that's it. But if you nail this model, you can have players who have bought like 100 times, so that you can, from individual players, you can make much more money. And merchandising, what I mean by that is that you basically surface those virtual goods, those resources, currencies, gems, whatever you're selling. You have to really bring them forth that, okay, do you get it, dear player? If you buy this, you're able to do this. if you buy that, you're able to do that. So there's a lot of these like subtle design decisions that you have to do in a sophisticated and a good way. Okay, and it also allows for a product manager who is basically taking care of the product and trying to optimize and keep it alive and all that, much more sort of tools to work with. You can create much more different price points, you can create sales much more easily and at least in a diverse way. So you're trying to find different profile players with different sized wallets and try to get them to open their wallets basically. All right. So, and this is like, I think Miska is gonna come talk on Thursday. So Mikhail Katkov, former colleague of mine. So he has this blog where he has analyzed a number of these games. So this is one success formula. It's not the only one, but obviously something that many developers are chasing. So how Clash of Clans basically works. And to answer your question earlier, it's basically this is the like high level, you know, economy, how it works. What are the sinks and sources? Where do players get these currencies and where they are able to sink them? And then of course, how, for instance, the different resources are produced, that changes throughout the player's lifetime, progress throughout the game. And those are modeled basically, so basically the answer is in the Excel sheets. And so we have Excel sheets that are then basically changed into a format that the game code understands. And so if we make some changes to the balance of the game, it basically draws stuff from an Excel sheet. That's the really sort of pragmatic way to answer your question. Yeah.
Are there any numbers like in the conversion rate in the surface and core model? Like percentages? Is 1% and core model and surface model?
Yeah, I honestly don't know because that's not data that is available, and I've been working only on the, you could say, the core model. So yeah, I don't want to start speculating with that, but it is true that if you even get 1% conversion on the core model, you are doing all right. And I suspect that in the surface model, yeah, it's hard. I won't speculate with that if it's higher at all. Yeah.
What about the figures on if you have the core model and then there's a player who made one purchase? How much more likely he's going to do another one than?
Yeah, I can just say out of experience that much more likely. So that first conversion to paying user is absolutely crucial because there's lots of, with these games, that's a big challenge with all the developers in this market, that really the biggest enemy of your game is that home button in your phone. And like if the player hasn't invested money or time into your game, basically they might never return. And therefore, if somebody, you get to open their wallet and make that one-time purchase, it instantly works for retention, because most of the time then you know, they know that, okay, in this sort of persistent game that these mostly the core model games are, he or she knows that, okay, now I have 50 gems, I can use them maybe even in a month's time, you know, I find use for them, or throughout the month I can trickle them into different things. So that works for retention as well. So it's this kind of like a vicious circle where you, or like actually fortunate circle for the developers if you get the first time purchase, because it's much more probable that you get the second. And then there's lots of players who have this attitude that I'll never pay for anything in these games. And yeah.
Another question?
Yeah.
Just to make sure about you said that casual games are more often, they could be more easily monetized through the
Surface, yep.
And then like hardcore games. This one, so would you call Angry Birds a casual game, and then even Heyday and Clash of Clans, are they?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'll save that for a couple of slides further. I'll come back to that. But anyhow, so you know, you're gonna see lots of these probably on Thursday if you attend. So I'm now making a plug for Miska's talk, but he's really good at this. So come and listen to him. And I just wanted to make a kind of like a sort of a dip before we move on to game design in general, of how, if you have experience or have had interest in the sort of more sort of traditional types of game design, and how free-to-play game design, you want to learn how that really sort of diverges from that. Like for instance, personally, I was faced with this challenge when we were making this game called Army Attack for Facebook. So we had a very successful and well-known reference title, Advance Wars, for Nintendo DS, and or even earlier, I suppose, GBA. And so we were facing basically this dilemma that how to take this game, which is premium game, no microtransactions, everything, and take the good parts of it and how to apply it to the free-to-play context. And this has been, of course, a sort of a dilemma that many game developers stepping into the free-to-play space have been faced with. And so the way I see is that many of the truths, sort of eternal truths of game design still, they are there and you should strive for them. And really like free-to-play, even this core model is kind of like, if you're familiar with The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell, it's a good book. You should read it if you're interested in game design. He talks about different lenses with which you should look at your game, your product. And free-to-play, whether it's the core or surface model, is really kind of like a lens that you have to use to look at every aspect of your game. So I think that's a fitting metaphor to think about how to, for instance, change an existing reference title from non-free-to-play market to a free-to-play game. And so this comes back to your question. So now, if you're faced with this decision, let's imagine for a while that we are all developers and we are sort of coming up with a game concept, and we're thinking that, okay, where could that sort of blue ocean in the App Store be, for instance, then it seems to be, at least this is not conclusive evidence, but it seems to be that what evidence we find from there at the moment is that the surface model caters in terms of just look and feel to more casual games like, you know, Angry Birds, Candy Crush, Where's My Water, and numerous other examples, whereas here you find games that are much more sort of drawing from the traditional gaming kind of like tropes and worlds and all that. But it's interesting, I think Heyday is an interesting point that they have managed to kind of tap this audience with this model more or less. And Farmville, of course, did the same, not quite as, I would say, sophisticated way, but still. But still, so in terms of, if you want to sort of then start thinking project that, okay, what kind of revenues and how could we get to a certain kind of revenues with these games? Here you need volume. Here you don't, I mean, volume of downloads, volume of players. Here you don't necessarily need that much of volume because the lifetime value that you're able to get, if you get it right from the players, is much higher. And I think that is, without, of course, having the exact numbers, I'm sure that the lifetime value of Clash of Clans players is much higher than the lifetime value of Heyday players, but there's more Heyday players than Clash of Clans players. So it's kind of like a typical archetypal example of this division. And of course, the reality is much more nuanced than this my very violent two-tiered model. Yeah.
Yeah, actually about that. What about in-game advertising?
Mm-hmm.
What's the situation? Is there any? Is that profitable at all?
Yeah. It can be, but I certainly wouldn't. And I suppose there are some kind of like successful, more like indie titles out there that have made some money with that. For instance, that they give the game out for free and then you can buy to get the ads away. But yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. So yeah, my answer to that, without having any kind of like fixed real numbers, I would say that I wouldn't base my monetization tactics and strategy just on that one model that. For instance, what we did back in Digital Chocolate was that once we saw that there was a certain amount of traction in a game, then you came into this sort of decision with the development process that, okay, we're going to do an update every 2 weeks. What can we fit into that update? And so if the game was monetizing, or actually if it had a good retention, but not that good of a conversion, then we could take advantage of networks that were basically offering like video ads that you could we could offer to the player, watch this video ad and get like 50 gems, like 50 premium currency. That's my kind of like way of my anecdote of the most successful sort of a tactic. But for us, in terms of revenue, it wasn't really a big thing, but in terms of retention, it was the sort of side effect was more significant, that okay, they got a bunch of those premium currency, which then kept them in the game for the longer time. So yeah, I would say that I wouldn't bank everything on that strategy with my game. Yeah.
Yeah, quickly building on the point, I actually worked on that topic.
Yeah.
And it's very true that like marketing or advertisement within games, they have a very negative feel and negative sort of like reputation, mainly due to the fact that they're implemented in a very passive or tasteless way. It's like you make a game and then you copy paste something very rudely on top of it, and it sort of obtrusive for the player. But then you have like examples, for example, Heyday, like we had the assignment, I guess today due, so you might add this to it. So there's the video option.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you watch a video and it's built into the game, so user gets the feeling that hey, I'm going to the movies and I get to see a video and I get something out of it. And if there's like a lot of research about it, and it seems that these type of mechanisms are then making the propensity of this kind of a user who hasn't paid anything to actually then monetize later on.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and with Heyday, I would say that the whole magazine concept is very clever, because it sort of opens up the theme for those kinds of things, that it doesn't feel so tacked on and stuff, those kinds of things. Yeah. Okay, I'll just summarize this and move on. So if you really violently break this down, it's basically that service has to do with selling more content. You have to structure a game according to that, and then the number of volume, the downloads really matters in terms of what your bottom line. And with the core one, you sell a bunch of different virtual goods, and it's the lifetime value of the customers that really matters. All right. So then I'll just go through some like shortcomings of the free-to-play that we've been seeing out there. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, I've been giving this part of the talk to fellow developers, and sort of I've started the talk that okay, this talk has to do with free-to-play, and believe it or not, with Bon Jovi, and so I'll come back to that later. But I've been sort of trying to identify examples of how you can fail or basically give the model a bad name without it necessarily deserving that. So there's a number of examples there where the types of failures that I've been touching about now multiple times, like Punch Quest, pretty decent game, tried its sort of chops in the free-to-play model. They did basically the same mistake that we did with mentioned Safari Kingdom. So they inflated the economy and all that, and then they sort of put a full stop to that one and went actually paid. And I suppose it's been working out for them okay. But of course, like they were going for those sort of promises of high lifetime values and multiple repeat purchases and all that the core model really facilitates, and they basically failed. And of course, when developers and the audience sees this kind of news, then it kind of like starts them second guessing whether this model works. But that's just life. I've had my hits and misses definitely as any game developer, so you can fail in this business in multiple ways. But really, I think from the player perspective, these are the examples that are sort of the worst, you could say. That if we think about what design means, design is something that is supposed to help players in terms of games or users in terms of other products to get to a goal, to accomplish a task. And then we evaluate that product or service, that how well does it manage to serve the user, or how well does the game provide fun and engagement, or maybe even social interaction to the player. And so we've seen a number of examples of bad design, in the sense that there have been games, free-to-play games, that really try to milk the players. They try to obscure how the economy really works to a very high degree. They put sort of ultimatums into the players in terms of just simple, kind of like innocent-looking UI decisions. So here's a couple of examples. This popped up back in the day. My wife was playing this Facebook game, and then she started it one day, and then she asked me, what the hell is happening here? She was basically asked, well, the game started, this pop-up appeared, and the only way to close this pop-up was to press this green button. So in terms of UI design, you were sort of left at gunpoint that, okay, you have to give us an email if you want to play this game, and that's of course that's just bad design. I mean, you should, it's very deliberate that the usual X on top of there, that is a UA convention, is not available there. So that's one example of sort of trying to get the emails of players in order to build like a customer base and do some CRM and approach them and spam them with other games. They were too far. Then one sort of, you could say, really obscene example from the App Store. It's not in the App Store anymore, it's been pulled since, but this was a game called Super Monster Brothers. You can guess from the game how original it is in many other aspects, but basically without just like scrolling down different characters that were available to buy in the game, instantly took you to this confirmation screen. And as you can see, maybe you can see, but the price point is $109.99. So if I just like, if I have the setting that I don't even need to input my password when I make those purchases, and I just happen to tap that one, then I paid $110. And obviously Apple should spot these, and eventually this game was taken out. But I mean, it's an example, really like a fishy example of how the player, there have been developers out there who try to exploit their players. And of course, like there was a recent news that Apple returned something like, what was it, $32 million to players who basically were sort of reporting accidental purchases, and most of those probably were like their kids buying stuff. But then again, as a parent, that's not rocket science to prevent that. But still, so these are the kinds of challenges that developers are facing. But then again, as a developer, you can choose otherwise and not put these kinds of tactics into your game. Another example where you can really fail is what I mentioned before, the whole pay-to-win scenario. And it's difficult because then again, you do want to give some benefit for the players that pay for your game if you're operating in this context. So it's a tough balance to find that, okay, how could we give them something that then doesn't make them overtly powerful against the guys who don't pay. And this is especially prominent and difficult with competitive games. And this, I mentioned these examples, but some more details here. There's a lot of stuff here, but I'll just try to summarize it. So this is Forza Motorsport 5, and this is NBA 2K14, which I mentioned before, that they have now, with their PS4 titles, have implemented a certain kind of a virtual economy to the game, and then microtransactions to support that. So Forza had to back off. They had they had put the screw very tight. So, and of course, what makes this even more troublesome is the fact that these are players who have paid already €70 or $70, 60 euros for the game, and now in these games there are moments where they can't really play all the modes that they would want even after that 70 euro purchase. So this NBA 2K14 is such that there's this virtual currency in the game which you collect by playing the different modes of the game, but then again in every mode there's also sinks of that currency. So up to the point where you can't even change your sort of starting lineup in your basketball game without spending a bunch of virtual currency. And if you know anything about sports games, that's the most sort of trivial thing that you should always be able to do. And now we are reportedly, players are facing situations where they would have to pay some more to change their opening lineup in a sports game. So, and that sounds really atrocious. And with the Forza, they had to sort of crank up the production of virtual currency to the player, and then at the same time bringing down the price of new cars, what they're selling with real money in the game. So they had really, basically they had been greedy. That's I think the only way to describe that. And so the economy was tilted in a very tight paywall type of a solution. There's an interesting side story to this NBA 2K14 that there is this app. So you can find these URLs once you get the materials. So this is an analysis from one sports gaming site of a journalist, writer suffering with this NBA game. But then some of these criticism has been discounted that, okay, when you download this app, this companion app, and check into that on a daily basis, you are able to collect much more virtual currency. But then again, that doesn't really change the thing that it's a premium AAA 70 euro titles to start with. So they are learning, but making big titles, making big mistakes, and big publishers making big mistakes, I think. And there's no doubt that there are still lots of these growing pains. So even if the model has been definitely proven, it's been consolidating in a way that it's hard to break into with the new concept and new small companies. This is a good quote from and a good piece at Poker Gamer just recently, sort of looking back how the free-to-play model is doing and what's going to happen in 2014. So basically, sort of voicing this dilemma that I might as well just read it. As an industry, we have to get better at this. We need to make players feel like they are getting a bargain in not paying upfront for a game, and then not mind so much when we, developers, try and get compensated for our hard work. So it's spelling out quite well that sort of dilemma where we are as developers, that it's not charity, but then again, in many cases, 98% of our players don't ever buy something. So it's fascinating, to use one word. And this sort of leads us to the dilemma of, I've been really talking about this quite a lot already, but the fact that how do you balance that free versus paid fun in the same product? Games are supposed to be fun, and in a way, in this free-to-play, they should be even more fun to the ones that pay, but they still need to be fun for the others. So that's the sort of recurring dilemma that I find myself speaking about here. And now, if you think about the criticism towards the free-to-play model in general, I think the best argument against it is that actually free-to-play is more fair than, for instance, this kind of an expensive one-time purchase console title, because then you can try it for free and decide if you want to pay and how much you pay. Now, this, of course, this comes sort of into a slightly dubious light if you think about the bad design examples that I had. So certainly it's hard to defend this argument if you have design decisions that we just saw. But yeah, you had a question.
Well, what about AAA titles and demos for those games that they produce?
Yeah.
Pretty much doing the same thing?
Well, demo is also, it's always a limited kind of slice of the game from some part of the game. So whereas these games, especially if they go with the core model, they have a persistent world which you start from the very beginning. So at least the way that you get a taste of that game is oftentimes different. There, of course, there can be demos of the sort of first five minutes as well. So, but yeah, then again, in order to, I think there's a significantly different audience in terms of how many people go into the trouble of downloading demos on their consoles versus the mobile market. So there are similarities, but then again, few demos have like an in-game link to buy the full game. I know there are such solutions, but it's not the norm really. But anyhow, so even myself, who have been working with this free-to-play model now for almost 5 years, have I feel that this is a good argument, but I kind of have felt kind of like uneasy about it because I've seen those bad examples out there. So what I'm coming to as a kind of like a war cry as how these games should try to be developed is that in order for that argument to hold true, you have to create this kind of a game where if you get the players to pay and they pay even more, the game should become more fun. And that's very easy to say and it's quite abstract, but what I'm saying to fellow developers is that let's try to find ways to do that. And this was also, the same idea was voiced pretty well in a piece at Gamma Sutra, which is a prominent game development site, where there was this a blog post titled 7 Ways to Fail at Free-to-Play. It's an okay post, but I think the comments are even better. And so basically, this guy is voicing the same principle out that, ultimately the whole structure of the game must be as much about having an enjoyable experience as well as being able to make the experience more enjoyable by injecting money, with the knowledge that the more money you put into the game, the more it becomes enjoyable. So this is really like the value proposition that you need to try to build into the game. And of course, how you do it is very also genre dependent, that one solution might not work in another. And therefore, one example that I want to give here to return to World of Tanks is this whole aspect of games which require a lot of skill, and then try to balance these paying players and non-paying players. So this is a very interesting blog post from a very experienced World of Tanks player. And once again, you can find it through that URL later, but basically he embarked on this experiment that he wanted to answer 2 questions. That is it possible for a non-paying customer to be reasonably competitive World of Tanks? World of Tanks is a super competitive game. But if you never pay anything, could you get at least close to the high leaderboards on top of the charts? And is it possible for a customer who does not use premium ammo, as I mentioned before, that was the ammo that does more damage, so helps you win the games, does not use premium ammo to compete at a high level, like in the top 5% of the players. And he has played over 3,000 matches of World of Tanks, so he should know what he's talking about. And so his answers were, in this experiment, that yes and yes, he was able to do that, but of course it took a lot of practice. It took basically 3,000 matches, and I don't know how many of those kind of first 1,000 were those practice matches, and that of course takes a lot of time. So in that way, skill is one way to accommodate that free fun. So you can get players to desire for the mastering the game. And then, of course, the key question becomes that is it possible, as this guy asks. And according to this experiment, World of Tanks has been super successful. They have also tweaked the game quite a bit, so the premium ammo is not quite what it used to be. But that enables this to happen, that yes, there is a belief that you can manage, you can compete in these games without ever paying anything, and it's fun. It might be even funner if you pay and get that awesome premium ammo. I suppose that's the value proposition that the World of Tanks developers want to give. And of course, like in other kinds of games, so in our game Supernauts, it's a very different game from World of Tanks, but we certainly try to live by this principle of that more you pay, the more fun the game becomes. So basically the game is about facilitating creativity in a way that we want to get players to build awesome stuff. And the more you pay, the more you can build, basically. The more different materials you get in the game, the faster you get them. So in our small way, we're trying to live by that principle and put that into work in the game. Okay, I'm coming pretty close to the end. Any questions at this point? Okay, so I'll just breeze through. So I'll basically try to summarize that what I think is the sustainable way to keep cranking out great free-to-play games is like there on your right, and then the sort of bad examples we've been seeing is on the left. So if you think about the evolution of free-to-play in the light of the examples that I've been using here, this is like the devolved form that we should, as developers, forget. So we shouldn't implement pay-to-win. We should avoid that. We should avoid those very aggressive merchandising solutions like that email query and also pushing stuff in the face of the players. Then again, as I said, merchandising and surfacing the virtual goods that you want to sell, it's important, but there's like a good design way to do it and there are bad ways to do it. Try to look at the subtle, better ways. Then one kind of principle that we've seen in the sort of early forms of free-to-play has been that the player should be taken to the shop quite early, during the first session of the game, that we still have him or her, so that they could know if they want to spend money, where should they spend it. But you can also take that to a sort of a very unfruitful extreme that, you know, we have seen games where there's this piece of writing, a column at Pocket Gamer, the site called Monetizer, where they analyze free-to-play games according to different criteria. And one of their criteria is time to shop. So they basically measure in seconds from the very beginning of the game launches for the player how much time does it take to get that the shop is introduced for them and the possibility of making in-app purchases. And like we have seen examples where, you know, it's in your face in like 20 seconds, and in practice that's not necessarily a very good experience. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but at least give a thought how you could do it that in a subtle and a sort of organic way. And now we've seen companies that try to, and games that try to be sort of whale-driven, that they really privilege those players who would be willing to pay like tons and tons of money. And that's like basically the product strategy that, okay, this game, we're really, the sort of guys who spend under $100, they're nothing. Let's not care about them. Let's cater for the whales. And you can go into I think excessive direction with that. And what this often leads to is this dilemma that the worst case that can really happen, that if you are able to convert a player into a paying player, then you basically exhaust their engagement by making them too powerful, giving them too, you know, basically that they sort of exhaust the content of the game by that one-time purchase. And that's basically doesn't work for your retention, which is the fundamental thing that you need to basically protect in your games and design for. So therefore, to counter these devolved examples, what I'm basically asking for is that instead of pay to win, you have to build this game where those players who don't want to pay, they need to grind. They need to do some sort of menial task to collect resources or whatever. But I mean, you have to balance it in a way that they understand that that is the way to master the game or to be competitive. And then I'm basically talking for the clear value proposition. It's not easy to do, that's why many games fail. It's very easy to muddle your value proposition and your designs. But really, in opposition to that very aggressive merchandising and throwing the shop into the player's face even before he understands what is this game about, you should design shops that kind of solve problems for the player. They arise from their needs in the game in a more organic fashion, so that they are really into the game, they understand what they're getting if they use money. And I don't want to be a hypocrite. I mean, we need those whales in this business. You know, I don't want to say that, okay, we're just catering for those people who spend €2, because that's not really going to take the business anywhere. But still, you know, there's a difference between designing a game economy that accommodates whales so that you can sink hundreds and hundreds of dollars, for instance, to the game, versus designing especially for that. So you have to find that balance. And if you manage to do that, then you are in this principle that the more you pay, the more enjoyable the game becomes. So basically, the engagement that you have in the game is relative to the spending rather than vice versa. So the building blocks really of this sustainable free-to-play is that, you know, things don't really change. We need to make better games. We still need to make these games fun, even if fun is a very sort of abstract word. Losing might even be fun if you're able to take revenge. It's much more nuanced than that. But anyhow, you have to create that engagement, which leads to retention. If you don't have these two pieces of the puzzle, you will never have monetization. So in essence, fun is the sort of glue that keeps these kind of like KPIs, performance indicators in place and together. Yeah, so it really, the challenge remains the same. GDC, Game Developers Conference, is the biggest event for developers every year. Their tagline has been for multiple years that make better games, and that challenge really still remains. And my point is that if you really look at like the top 5 grossing games, this is like the key markets out there. There are some sort of outliers like China and whatnot that are different, but you see these titles here, and I generally think that they are very good games. They are very well executed, because I mean, in game developments, everybody can come up with ideas, everybody can take those ideas further, but executing them well is freaking hard. And these games have managed to do that, so I at least respect them as a developer. And it's really like in every developer's interest, I find, to evolve the way free-to-play works. And that's how I feel that it can be made a sustainable business model and not just a fad that like 5 years from now we just laugh at free-to-play, that it was this weird human experiment in the games business, and now we're back to this good old premium stuff. I don't honestly think that there's a return, but I mean, we can screw this up as developers in multiple ways if we are too greedy and we do bad design and all that. So this leads me to my Bon Jovi reference that I've been using, so we shouldn't give free-to-play a bad name. But yeah, that's actually pretty much what I have. So follow us, Grand Crew, on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to follow that.